So today our featured speaker is Ray Rigoglioso. I think I said it right. Yeah, Ray? Okay, good.
Awesome.
Close enough. He's one of today's most active voices in the world of gay and queer men's spirituality. He's the founder and executive director of Gay Men of Wisdom, and he's the author of Gay Men and the Way Forward. Is that right, Ray? So,
The new way forward. Yes.
and the new way forward. I knew I was missing something. And the new way forward. Thank you. Where he's been a professional coach since 2009, and he's also an expert workshop facilitator. If any of you've had the pleasure of taking one of his workshops, you would know that this is true. He's led many successful workshops at Easton Mountain and at other spaces, and he's going to talk to us today about what is the secret behind making a really successful workshop. He's going to be interviewed by Brian Gorman, who is also a coach who specializes in change making and also an accomplished workshop presenter. And without further ado, I'll let you boys take it away.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Ray. It was really good reconnecting with you to prepare for this workshop. So I'm looking forward to this. We're going to begin at the beginning, and somebody emails you or calls you up, or you just have an opportunity to create a new workshop. How do you get started thinking about the workshop? Where do you begin?
Well, I mean, I think it begins with understanding the kind of content you want to deliver, understanding the context, the timing, the time frame, all of that, because they're all going to affect what you choose. And I mean, I think the other way to approach it also is that you might want to begin a workshop from an inspiration you have. So the source of it can come from many different places. But I always believe in if someone comes to you with a workshop idea, I will always begin having a conversation with that person about what do you want to achieve, what kind of impact do you want to have, what do you want people to experience, and etc. That's where I would begin.
So it sounds almost like you begin at the end.
Yeah.
Interesting. And we've heard a number of different people talk about what made successful workshops for them, and you've given us some insight yourself. What would you say are, from your perspective, the keys to workshop success?
Yeah, as I was listening to everyone share, I thought, well, here we have it. We could just go home, right? I think we have a lot of experts in this room, people who really know the keys, right? I heard them in almost all of actually in all of everything that folks shared. And Brian, you and I talked about this before the call. I think what's most important is to determine what experience you want your participants to have. What do you want them to leave with? As you were saying, beginning with the end. And working backwards. I always begin from when I create a workshop, it's usually because I have some type of an inspiration. I want people to leave with a certain set of ideas. So beginning with that end in mind is important. And I heard this, I mean, as I shared, like one of my mentors in terms of developing workshops is Jennifer Britton. And she comes from a training and facilitation background. And one of the things she said is that adult learners they have about a 7 to 10 minute attention span before you change modalities. And there really is something to that. And so what I try to do, and everyone has said this, like different modalities, writing, reading, dyads, groups, music, body-centered modalities, etc. So you try to hit the different ways that adults learn.
Do you have any overarching principles or goals for the workshops that you design and deliver?
I think, God, I try to make sure people don't fall asleep. Let's start there. All right. And, so that they stay engaged. And, it really depends on the content. A lot of what I do with Gay Men of Wisdom is I'm trying to establish a common understanding of something that we all know in ourselves, but we don't generally have the language to express. So, in terms of an overarching goal for what I do with Gay Men of Wisdom, it's that I want to I have a point that I want to make. And the point is to illustrate some aspect of gay men's gifts. So what I try to do is to begin with a common understanding. We begin with brainstorming so that everyone in the group, and someone said this as well, that you pull out the expertise of the people in the room, that is a really good way of engaging people. And that's usually where I start with one type of workshop, if it's a standalone workshop. And again, if it's a longer program, we could talk about that. There's like a flow to a longer program. But let's say you have a 2-hour workshop. For me, I want to establish a point, and I want to help them learn something about themselves that I have a pretty good sense that they already know, but they haven't elicited. So you really begin with that drawing out. And I forget the rest of the question. And of course, what's great is that just as this call started, we have people outside who are drilling and hammering. Perfect timing. So thus these so slightly distracted. It's because there are guys right out here drilling and hammering in the dark.
In our conversation in preparing for this workshop, one of the things you talked about was knowing how you want to deliver the content. Mm-hmm. Can you say more about that?
Sure. Yeah. And I think it goes back to these different modalities. I think it probably is easiest to use an example, okay, rather than to speak abstract. So let's just say, okay, so one of the things I most recently did is I created a workshop on sexual leadership. And this is a gift. It's probably the most complex and fundamental gift of gay men. And what I wanted gay men to recognize is I wanted them to see the connections between how they express themselves sexually and how they express themselves socially. So it's this very abstract concept that once you begin to see it in person, the light bulb goes on, as someone was saying, using that term. So I had a very specific end in mind. I wanted the guys to see the relationship between these two, because we think of our sexuality and we think of it as just having we don't really think of our sexuality other than being our sexuality. But as we learned in coaching, people are consistent. So that when we look at how we express our sexuality, we can see clues about how we express ourselves socially. So that was the whole point, is to go through and to pull. One of the things I did is I pulled all the information from the book. So this was a learning process. So I looked I had them look at the list of how gay men express ourselves differently, and then look at the corresponding social innovations. And then I had them check all of the pairings off. This appears in the book. It's actually a table called the Gay Male Sexual Leadership Laboratory, because the idea is that our sexual expression is a laboratory for how we express ourselves socially. So the idea is, okay, look at all the ways you express your sexuality in ways that are different, and then check and look at the corresponding social innovation. Check them all off, all of those pairs that apply to you, then rank them, the top 6, and then we're going to explore these in pairs. We're going to have a conversation with 6 people about how you express the sexual component and the social component. And I broke them into pairs. And so in 5 minutes, they 5 minutes each. It was kind of like speed dating. And I wanted it to be kind of like cruising in a way, right? So this idea, it's like, let's take this idea of, this is how gay men, we can cruise and cruise each other, have multiple partners. Well, we're going to have multiple partners to discuss the Sexual Leadership Laboratory. So at the end of 30 minutes, they had 6 conversations about their sexual and social contributions. So it's again, it's like, I begin with the end point that I want to help convey a concept. And it's actually really, really challenging to help people come to a pre-established conclusion, but to come to it on their own.
One of the things that you're talking about there is something that I also really try to do in my workshops and even in my presentations. For me, if I can get people to get new insight from their own history, their own experience, takes much more root than if it's just something that's heard or read.
Yeah, and I do think it's like, you don't want to, I mean, simple didactic workshops will put people to sleep and they won't learn. So the whole idea of all of these different methodologies is to establish a grounding in one's own experience through different processes.
It's a sort of a guided exploration, if you will, it sounds like.
Yeah.
For me, some of the most effective workshops have come across as being organic. They just sort of naturally flow through a number of different experiences from a beginning to the end. And yet it's, I know that doesn't happen naturally, doesn't happen organically, even though it feels that. How much preparation do you do to get your workshops flow?
Hours and hours of workshop of preparation. I mean, except for all but the most open and fluid discussion groups, my style is, it might seem organic, but that's because I've prepared. And some experiences, and everyone has a different style. So I think part of this is really understanding your strength. It might be that being more in the moment works for you. So I think understanding that is important so that you can develop a workshop that flows for you. With my workshop, and Harry talked about this, that you know, doing what you say you're going to do in the way you say you're going to do it, I think is really important. So I start with that original idea, that original concept. What do I want them to leave with? And then I say, okay, well, where do we need to begin so that they can, and it's a flow. It's a structured flow of exploration. It goes down, 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 and then up, right? So you want them to end with a conclusion. And I time every segment, and then I tweak it, and then I practice it, and then I write. I usually have written materials for the kind of work I do. There's always participant materials, so I'm always having to match my facilitator's materials with the participant manual as well. And it takes many hours, and I think it's something like 5 to 7 hours of classroom of preparation per hour in the classroom, or something like that. It's some very large number, so that it comes across as, oh, well, it was effortless. Well, it's only effortless because you practiced, you planned, you prepared, you timed it. And so you know your stuff when you go into it.
So this is not a question I asked earlier.
Okay. Oh.
It's a surprise. and so you do all of this planning, and then there is a surprise in the workshop. Somebody just really either blossoms fully or really crashes into what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that and get back on track to do what you said you were going to do?
Well, it happens. And I think being flexible in the moment is is the art of facilitating a good workshop. Once you can have your plans and they can go awry. And I think the challenge is understanding when to put the structure on hold to allow for the experience that has organically flowed. I mean, I did a segment on camp and drag. I mean, it was outrageous. One of the guys showed up in drag, or actually he brought drag with him. He changed into it in the middle. And there was this one other participant for whom this gift really set him. He finally understood the concept of the gifts. And it almost got out of control because people were like, the energy of camp and drag was in the room. And I knew we would need to take more time. So I just paused and I said, okay, guys, I'd like to ask, this is a really rich conversation. Would you mind if we go over 15 or 20 minutes? I could see it happening. So I wanted to establish a new agreement with the folks. And everyone said yes, because it was so rich. Other times, some really great insight has happened. And I would know, you know what? That next exploration is not as important in this moment. What's really important is what this person just learned and what the group experienced. So so it's kind of like knowing when to vary from your script and be in the moment, really listening and being fully present for your participants, and then being able to kind of bring it back. And so sometimes you've got to jettison maybe a third of what you're doing or a quarter of what you're doing to allow for the experience, and that's perfect.
Could you talk a little bit about the role of questions and how you shape your questions and so forth?
Yeah, and this is, I mean, for my purposes, the questions are extremely important because I'm trying to elicit what I pretty much suspect guys know about themselves, that gay men know about themselves. And I remember I worked with a survey research firm. It was a nonprofit. We did patient-centered surveys, and I worked with survey researchers. They would create questions, and they would write questions and then test them in focus groups, because the thing about questions is that you might think they're eliciting the kind of answer you want, but they're eliciting an entirely different answer. So you kind of need to test them and go back and refine. And I always have someone I've worked with who's been a volunteer of mine who basically serves as my curriculum mentor. I always have someone else look at my questions and that person will look at them with a fresh set of eyes and we'll kind of have an understanding of what is the flow. And we'll say, Ray, that question is going to elicit that type of response. I don't think that's really or he'll say, I don't know what you're trying to get at here. So it's in the abstract, it's hard to describe what a good question is or isn't. The best question elicits the answer that you want to elicit, not an answer that you don't want to elicit.
Could you give us maybe, Ray, some examples of questions that you began with that weren't going to work and how you reshaped them?
Oh, I can't ever remember. That's such a tough one because they get erased. I write over them when I'm doing in my Word documents. I honestly, for the life of me, I would not be able to answer that question. Yeah, but you know, they might have been a little murky. They might not have been fully formed ideas. So that's kind of the best I might be able to answer that question, right?
It would seem to me, and again in the abstract, not with specific examples, but what you're really doing in the workshop is asking good coaching questions.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's one of the core competencies of coaching. It's powerful questioning, and again, it really depends on your context. What do you want your participants to learn about themselves? Generally speaking, that's what we're all doing. We're not necessarily teaching, we might be teaching skills, but mostly in coaching workshops, it's about reflection, learning about oneself. Yeah.
So at the end of the day, Ray, how do you determine whether or not your workshop was successful? Is it the applause at the end, or?
I think you know if it's successful. If you're in tune with your participants, I mean, again, one of the things I do, I'll always vary the format. So we'll start out with a group brainstorming, then I'll have them do some writing to reflect on it, then discuss it in pairs, and then we'll do something else, and then maybe some more writing and small groups. And so I walk around, I listen, always listen to the feedback, listen. And it's one of the things we learn in coaching is listen to what's not being said, listen to the awkward silences, feel the energy of the people of the conversation. And often that energy will tell you whether you're on the right track, and don't be afraid to name it. I was in the middle of the weekend intensive before I wrote the book, and I went in with a set of expectations. I thought we're more wounded around the feminine, and we have more work to do around the feminine than we do the masculine. And we were exploring what the feminine and the masculine were, and I remember at one point there was this awkward silence. I thought, and I went on through my prepared materials, and then I said, no, wait, let's just go back. What just happened here? I just heard, I'd like to explore this because I asked this question and it seemed to fall flat. What was that about? And what I learned is that the guys in the group felt a lot more wounded around the masculine than they did the feminine, that I thought and this is, it actually wound up changing my entire perspective on the feminine versus the masculine as gay men relate to them. And it changed my argument, because it became such a rich exploration. So when I listened to that awkwardness that wasn't spoken, that's where the learning took place for me too. It was this whole we explored the shadow masculine, and subjugation, and we all know what the shadow masculine is and how it's running our country and our world amok. So listen so that it's successful when you have that feeling, when you can observe the reactions and the engagement, when you get the energy, when you see people engaged, and you kind of know when it falls flat too.
Do you use formal evaluations as well?
Yeah, always. I always have a written, a couple of different questions that they can rate on the facilitator's knowledge, the experience, and then a place to write questions or comments. Yeah, and that will give you information. That's also helpful as well. Yeah.
So I have one more coaching question for you, and then we're going to open the floor up for questions more generally. Who do you need to be who do you need to be a good workshop facilitator?
Yeah, I think who is always that? That's such a tough question. I'd like to say what. Who is your best self? Is your most prepared self? I think Arthur Ashe said that confidence comes from preparation. So really going into it, having prepared so that you can be, and this is my style, is being to know it as much as I can so that I can allow for fluidity and motion. And flexibility. That's really what the word I'm looking to use. I think that your best confident self, knowing that you are the expert in whatever experience you're facilitating.
Thank you. Let's get some questions from the other gentlemen in the room. Just unmute yourselves and anyone.
Okay, well, I have some questions.
Go, Alan.
First of all, I love hearing you talk about all the preparation that's required. I read the autobiography of Steve Martin, who made all this effortless looking comedy. And the truth is he spent years busting his ass experimenting with things before all those silly jokes appeared in the world. But what I'm curious about is I've noticed a thing in workshops or presentations that I've been involved in where there's kind of there's a set of things they do. And it usually starts with some kind of personal story or vulnerable thing to like get the audience connected. So I'm curious where you are with that. Do you have like a template, and where do you, how vulnerable do you make yourself? Two questions.
So are you saying that the facilitator makes him or herself vulnerable, or that you're inviting vulnerability among participants?
Yeah. I'm actually, unfortunately, I realized I just asked two questions, so let's stick to the vulnerability one.
Okay. All right.
How vulnerable do you make yourself as a facilitator? When do you cross over into it being too much about your story and not facilitating the group?
I rarely bring myself into it, and you could say that that's a flaw. I suppose some people will really bring their own personal story in. I think it's less important to talk about myself and much more important for people to talk about themselves, for the participants to talk about each other. I personally, I would think, unless people really know me, then I might get a little more personal with it. But I don't think it's going to mean as much, because I think it's going to create, this is my bias, okay? I think it will create a false sense of intimacy.
Yeah.
And I think what's much better is to get the participants engaged with their own learning process and with each other. And that's what will create more intimacy.
And so I'm going to add my perspective on that, which aligns some with Ray and not completely. You need to create a safe space.
Yeah.
And so as Ray was talking about before, you need to sort of dance. And there are times, most of the time I would say, I do exactly what Ray is talking about. And every once in a while, I know that I'm going into a very different and very different environment. And I'll give you an example. About a year and a half ago, I did a workshop for the Syracuse University Business School alumni. They don't know me. I don't know them. I don't look very business school. And we all had in common Syracuse University. And so I brought in at the beginning a little of my history with Syracuse University as a foundation for the topic that I was talking about, which was change. So I do dance into the personal at times where I feel it's going to help legitimize me and make the space safer for participants. Alan, you had a second part of that question if you want to throw it back out.
Thank you. Okay. I was wondering if you have a template. Do you have like, okay, this workshop, I'm going to have, this percentage is this percentage is this percentage is this. Going around the circle saying hello, for example, being one of the things that might be in there. Do you have a template?
Kinda, sorta. There are definitely segments that appear in every workshop. There's an introduction. There's always, an introduction to the material. I always give an overview. For instance, this is what you can expect. This is how long we'll be here. If we're going to take a break, we'll take a break at this time. So you tell them what you're going to tell them, right? Then you give there's always a set of working agreements, as Brian was talking about. You create a safe space. You definitely want to do that. And then participant introductions. And then you kind of begin with the material. That's sort of standard.
Okay. Yeah.
And then from there, my particular, and again, I think everyone has a different style. So just because this is my style doesn't mean it's going to be everyone else's. But I usually find there are about 3 or 4 different ways that show up, modalities: group brainstorming, writing, discussions in pairs. That it seems to kind of flow in that way. And then we switch it again. So maybe there's some reading, and then there's some writing, and then there's a group, discussions in small groups. Or maybe there's a writing, a drawing exercise, and then you do a group debrief. So there are some standards.
Okay.
There are going to be some types of segments that show up. And of course, you always want to have some type of a conclusion, like a reflection. What did you learn? What's your takeaway? And then you do your closeout.
I love it. Thank you.
Other questions?
Hi, this is.
Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Hi, this is Tom. I had a question about compressing material. It's mostly because some formats for workshops are not particularly long. And so you have to learn to be able to scale the material to the time that you have available. Mm-hmm. And I do find that that's a particular difficulty, particularly if you do have certain segments that you kind of want to always put in, like some sort of overview introduction, some sort of here's general content, then you have a brainstorming about the content for a moment, then you might move to an application of the content. So I'm finding that if you get to introduce, outlay the content, brainstorm on the content, and then you try to apply the content, a lot of the time is already gone. Yeah. So I just want to hear more about how you compress material.
Yeah, one of the ways I do that with introductions is if I'm really short on time, I'll say, introduce yourself to a neighbor. So then rather than going around the group, that'll save about 10 or 15 minutes. So at least everyone has some type of engagement. And that's a kind of a tried and true technique to compress. You could also have it depends on the context. If you share your working agreements ahead of time, perhaps you could email or send them to, again, it depends on how the people are coming to you. You could say, look, please read these, and we're just going to skim them during the session itself. That's a way of getting through them quicker. And then, I think it's a process of killing your babies, as they call it. Really removing the things that you might love, absolutely love, but you can't do in that segment. And I find that small groups are another way of compressing time. So if you break people into groups of 3 or 4, rather than doing them having a full group discussion, you could explore a set of questions in less time with a small group than the full group. So those are some of the techniques I use to cheat a little bit.
If I can build on that for just a moment, it's dancing. And so I might have a report out at a certain point, and we should have been there 3 or 4 minutes ago or 5 minutes ago. And so I'll say, we're just going to go around the circle, and one word that is the most important thing that just came out of this last segment of work for you. And you'll still have somebody who, rambles on for a few sentences, but you will have again managed that compression.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Hey, I'm getting in. Yes. Not a question as much as a comment. First of all, I love you, Ray. And so I'm coming to anything that you show up for. Secondly, I'm looking forward to being in front of you for a presentation. So someday when it comes to Canada or close, let me know how I can help and how I can be there. And I really appreciated some of the things like, that it takes a lot of preparation, because I tend to do that. I make this document and I break it out by minute, and what's the core intention, what's the detail, what's the outcome I want, and what's the exercise, and I go through that numerous times. So to know that that's sometimes you figure you're isolated, right? So you've just given an insight and a confirmation that a good presentation requires good preparation. Oh, trademark.
Other questions we have?
Ray, I'm wondering if you have any learnings, any wisdom, any insight around getting people into the room, getting people to your workshops. What have you done that has been helpful to sell them?
That's always the biggest challenge, and it's what we face with Gay Men of Wisdom. I think one thing that, and it depends on your, again, it's all the context, but there's personal outreach makes a big difference. Harry talked about this. I remember us talking about getting people to my weekend program. He said, Ray, now is the time to invite people personally. That makes a big difference. There's, obviously you use all of the different media that are available to you, your mailing list, Facebook, Meetup, Eventbrite, or whatever groups you happen to belong to promote it. But I think that, when I've, when I've looked at what has made the difference in getting people to come back, especially if it's not a committed group, it's really personal outreach and letting the person know that you appreciate them and you want that person to attend.
Okay, we still have time for a few more questions here. Michael Patrick.
Hi, Ray, it's great to see you again. And I am going to be doing some workshops in the next month or two. And the other topic that comes up is pricing, how to set the price for a workshop so that it's going to equal the value that's delivered, but then not be a deterrent, not undersell or overprice or whatever. Do you have any insights on what we can use to set prices for workshops?
I think that's always a big challenge as well. And I'm not an expert in this. I can't say that I've done the best job in this area. What I have found is that if you price it too low, people won't value it. And I started out with that concept. I went to a model where we had very low pricing and a drop-in model, and it just didn't create commitment. And what I really think is that people value what they pay for. And I also think that there's at the same time, you need to think about what value do people perceive they will get. I wish I were better at this. All right. I wish I could say, oh yeah, set it really high. But if you do that, you're gonna turn people off. The question is, what's your intention? Do you is this an introductory experience that will invite people to attend a longer program? So maybe you want to make it free or very low cost. If it's something that's your bread and butter, where you really are bringing your expertise and you're bringing something of high value, set it a little higher. And what I also find is that if people balk at the cost, they're not going to be committed to your work. So I think it's sort of playing with those. It's looking at what will the market bear versus what so you want to maybe try to that's sort of one pole, and the other is what kind of value do you want them to perceive they're going to get.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice.
I have lots of questions.
Go, Alan.
I'll ask one more just because I'm curious. Stage fright. You get stage fright before you go out and do this? And if so, what do you do?
Rarely. I mean, if I were if I were singing, that would be totally, or like if I'm acting, if I have to remember something, forget it. I really have such an awful memory. Preparation, as I say, is everything. And I am always thankful, and I what's the word I'm looking for? I always get value when I prepare, so that I can go out there and it can seem effortless. And so therefore I'm not nervous. The way I reduce my stage fright is preparation. I mean, I will, before I do I've done my weekend program now 6 times, but I will make sure I go through it at least 2 or 3 times, the entire flow from the very beginning to the very end. I spend hours preparing this so that I can be completely in the moment and just let go of that added nervousness. So I can't emphasize enough the value in preparation.
Yeah, I want to pick up on your words there, Ray, so that you can be present in the moment. That for me, what I do is I make sure that I take a few minutes to get present in the moment before I get started, to really be centered and present, because fright is out in front of us. Mm-hmm. And if I'm here now, then I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. I like to get to a space early and be alone and do a little bit of a ritual. I will sometimes take a singing bowl and just like and rub it and like let the sound change the energy to cleanse the room. It's sort of my ritual way of preparing. And I find it helps me really center as well.
Okay, we have time for one more question, if there is one, before I turn it back to Will.
This is Harry. I think we might have a little bit more time, if you don't mind, because we're not going to do what are you working on today. We're just going to do finish up with questions for Ray. So I want to encourage everybody to speak up, and you may not have a question. For some reason, all these coaches on these calls get shy. And we don't know why that is, but you are just the cutest bunch of shy guys. You may want to make an observation, not necessarily ask a question. And I would make an observation that one of the best ways to stop being stage fright or being nervous is stop paying attention to yourself and pay attention to the people in front of you. Put your attention on them. And you can do anything if we are not self-conscious. And it's easy to get drawn back into it. The more, I think, probably the more introverted people are, the more likely they prefer to pay attention to themselves. But if you it's like a flashlight. If you put the light out there, then you can do anything you want to do because they know you're paying attention to them. Maybe some of you have tips you'd like to offer. Come on, let's cheer Ray on here. Now nobody's going to raise their hand.
I could speak a little bit about facilitation style. So something that's been useful to me is recognizing that although you're going into the room as authentic as you possibly can be, it's okay to bring a certain quality, a certain aspect of yourself that you might not usually pull out when you're in your everyday life, right? And oftentimes it's important to do that. So as a guy with like a theater training, I sometimes pull some of that theatrical presence when I'm in front of a room, and I've found that really valuable. And another thing that I've used that's been helpful for me is a grounding word. So it's a word that I want to bring into the room, like an energetic word that I want to bring into the room. So when I co-facilitate with Michael Wilson, who I co-founded Man Question with, we always decide ahead of time, like what energy we're bringing. Oftentimes it's like loving, playful, and connected or something like that. But it's been helpful for us to have something that we can come back to, like energetically. Okay, we want to bring this, and it kind of grounds us in that kind of energy that we want to bring into the room.
Hi, this is Tom. I have one thought and or observation about some of the difficulties of preparing for workshops. It depends on the format that you're trying to go for. If you're deciding we're going to do a fishbowl formatted workshop, that requires a certain kind of setup and a certain kind of conclusion that's very different from a more didactic and going through a series of, open conversation, small dyad group, not a writing exercise, where you segment things in smaller ways. So I was wondering if somebody could speak to the fishbowl format in particular in terms of how do you develop a curriculum for that? Because usually it's an exposure in an area that is open-ended and can't really be totally closed-ended about it. So I'm curious to see if people have thoughts on that.
Anyone?
I've done several fish bowls, but I'm not sure I understand the question. Tom, would you help me out there?
Okay, a fishbowl. Usually you have coaches trying to enact a coaching scene, and it's open-ended because the coaching will go wherever it needs to go. And the question is, when you run a workshop, you're usually trying to illustrate one or another set of ideas or principles or something you're focusing that fishbowl technique on. So my question becomes, how do you rein in the conversation so that it stays centered on what you need and want to cover?
Well, the fishbowl exercises or things that I've done have been, well, you've seen them at the beginning of the conference with the inner and outer circle, but having more than enough questions to pose, and giving starting out with a topic, and just kind of reading the room. I think what you're talking about is, I think, different. It's maybe more sandbox coaching or demonstration coaching. Is that what you mean?
A little bit more that way, yes, but you still want to invite the interaction in an open-ended way.
Oh.
So it can go almost anywhere. So it becomes a little tough to know how to regulate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tim, I learned fishbowl from you, and I use it in the weekend program. Okay. And I use it as a way to bring closure to what the guys have learned about celebrating gay manhood. So I pose I'll throw out, I have a list of questions, and one of them will be, well, what does gay manhood mean to you? And I think it's as with, and I don't remember if you included this in your model or not. I think you probably did, but there's a bit of, I will have my questions for the guys, but what can happen if you have enough people who sit in the inner circle is that they begin to sort of talk to each other. They begin to keep the conversation going. And the art of facilitating it is to know when to allow that and to know when to throw out a different question and to sort of change it if it goes a little too far off field or off course. But it's sort of a dance, I find, with the fishbowl facilitation style.
Yeah, and I know that sometimes the idea is to get in the inner circle, say your piece, and then get out to allow room for someone else to come in. And sometimes you have to. I give a gentle reminder of get in and get out. But it's again kind of reading the room, and it's. I hate to shut anyone down, and I like to keep it moving. I love ending the workshop with it. What a great idea. See, I'm valuable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a frivolous question. I am observing Brian Gorman and Michael Patrick are both speaking in front of a Japanese wave. Are you calling
Same one?
Studio, or your background is the same?
It's a big ocean.
They're in the same room.
It's a long story, Harry, but Michael had it first, and I went to Amazon and looked over several hundred. This was the one that I kept coming back to.
Oh my God, maybe we'll all end up getting one.
I don't see any airline seats.
I love it.
It's different.
Hi, guys. I just want to go back to an earlier question. Somebody asked about filling up the workshop, and I got something that would help with that. And it's a technique called the pre-sell. And the pre-sell means that you're talking about the workshop long before it's been scheduled, long before the details are worked out. And you're kind of building up an anticipation with your audience. And so they start asking questions and start interacting with you. And you've actually built up a lot of demand for it before you make the announcement. And that's one thing that will help you fill your workshop.
Thank you.
Is that written down somewhere, Jeff, or did you make this up?
It's something I've learned from somewhere. So I didn't make it up, but I just wanted to contribute that since it was an open question. I mean, there's a lot more you can talk about, but that was something I can explain in a couple of sentences that might be helpful.
And how do you spell that? I couldn't hear it correctly.
Pre-sell. Pressell.
Thank you.
So it basically means kind of starting the conversation way early about what you're going to do, who you're going to do it for, why you're doing it, and get a little interaction going so that by the time it's announced, you've built up some interest and demand when it wasn't available. So basically you're kind of seducing your folks by talking about something you're going to do, but it's not set in stone yet. It's not, you don't know when you're going to do it, etc. And then they get to want it. And then when it happens, then it's easier to fill it up. That makes sense to you guys?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
I want to add another approach, actually. As some of you know, I do a lot of work paired with a small business development consultant. And we go to market as the doobies. He is who you need, what you need to do to grow your business. And he does that from a consulting modality. And as a coach, I coach you on who you need to be to grow your business. And our basic go-to-market strategy is through workshops. And what we have been doing is finding, for a lot of reasons, including the fact that space is very expensive in New York City to make use of. We now have HSBC's small business banking. We have Capital One Small Business Banking, Bank of America Small Business Banking, and Wells Fargo, all sponsoring workshops. And so part of, not only are they providing the space and the refreshments, but they will be marketing workshops to their clients because we have sold them that we're going to be delivering value to their clients that will benefit their reputation. So that's another approach when you can align what you are delivering in a way that will benefit an organization that might sponsor it.
It's a great idea.
Okay, Ray, do you have any last thoughts for us before we start moving towards our conclusion?
It's terrific seeing all of you guys who I've not seen in a while and meeting those of you who I'm meeting for the first time. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all your insights and all your gay male wisdom on the subject. And thank you, Brian, for leading that conversation so nicely. And thank you for all those who contributed some of their own insight and wisdom around creating a successful workshop. I think that was a very valuable and rich conversation. So thank you.